Save the best for last. Not just because he's my student. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sebastian Rodriguez Duque. He is a doctoral candidate in philosophy at McGill, co-supervised by Professor Ingold back there, and myself. Sebastian is writing his dissertation on the ethical aspects of psychometrics, with an emphasis on the ethics of patient-reported outcome measures. He's also one of the key authors of the guidebook on measurement for youth mental health that I mentioned earlier in my own talk. And I owe very much of my thinking about the ethics of measurement to my many conversations with Sebastian. So I'm extremely grateful. And today he will speak about ethical iterations in psychosocial measurement. It's welcome, Sebastian.
Thanks a lot, Aaron, and hi again, everyone. And it's a great pleasure to be here, and especially thanks to all the speakers. It's been a fascinating set of talks all day. So thank you also for sticking around to listen to me. So I guess in terms of disclosure of how like some of the funders for that project are involved here, in terms of the guidebook, etc. But so. So I have to do two things. There we go. So here's just a brief outline of my talk. In the first instance, I'll just describe a collaboration between philosophers of science here at McGill that Aaron has mentioned already, and also health outcome researchers and clinicians at Foundry and at UBC. Then I'll discuss the role of ethical values in coordinating social measurements with their methods of measurement. So there'll be some overlap with some of the stuff we've heard about already. And then finally argue that what we require is a method for explicitly integrating values into psychosocial measurement. And that's what we call in our paper under review, ethical iterations. So in addition to the team Aaron already mentioned, our main partner was Foundry for this project. Many people there, but most importantly, young people, have been able to provide feedback on our work at different stages. So Foundry is a network of 19 centers, not 23, throughout British Columbia, and a virtual care team. And it was founded in 2015, and it serves about 10,000 youth a year. It runs on it's an integrated youth service. So what that means is that it, I'm getting myself confused between the many slides I'm juggling, but it's a one-stop shop basically where young people go and get support about issues on anything from mental health, substance abuse, to physical and sexual health, other social services, peer support, just socializing. Foundry is intended to provide evidence-based care and implements a data collection strategy and management system across its centers. And it makes questionnaires available via, say, tablets or mobile phones, as well as other means at the time of arrival at the sign-up and at different time points in the time where a person is with them. And as a newer organization, it's especially important for Foundry to provide evidence of positive impact that young people and their families might have based on their treatments. So, what area of measurement am I talking about? Well, it's psychometrics, broadly construed. And so psychometrics is the science of measuring mental traits, abilities, and attitudes. And it underlies the design of many patient-reported outcome measures, which are just called PROMs, and are a key set of tools in clinical research and also in health service delivery models more generally. So here is, we've talked about it already today, the PHQ-9, and it's a widespread used measure of depression. And I like to use it because it's a helpful example of just how much the DSM has authority on the shaping of these constructs. Its 9 items are based on the 9 items for the diagnosis of major depressive episodes in the DSM. And it was originally developed as a diagnostic aid and is broadly used in different instances with lots of different populations. Its scores range from 0 to 27. So for example, 10 to 14 indicate moderate depression. But so, for example, the screening, the PHQ-9 can be used as a screening tool, and it has been used as a screening tool at Foundry. There are different purposes for measurement that we cover in the guidebook. One of them is screening, but you can have progress tracking, diagnosis, evaluation of service impact. And so screening is one of several purposes for measurement that we might have. Screening is crucial because that's one of the only ways to know who's coming through your door, for what reason, and to match them with the right level of service. So at Foundry, the PHQ-9 is, as I said, sometimes been used, and you can see kind of how you can start to try to map sort of the scores to where you would be put onto the service level in the stepped care model, for instance. But in the context, credit to graphics like this, I'll go to Darius who took all of these pictures, sometimes cheat them. But in the context of screening, the use of a tool like the PHQ-9 can have unintended effects. And so we've kind of listened to some of these today. So suppose you're a young person who's trekked for 2 hours to get to a Foundry center. It's the winter in the Canadian Rockies. You're upset, you're in distress, you make it to the center finally, you step up to the counter, and they hand you a screening questionnaire right away and tell you to come back when it's filled. And it's a PHQ-9, you fill it out, you get a 20, and now you're a 20 of depression, and you're not sure what that means or how that helps you. Well, we think, in our paper, we argue that the experience of being measurement affects and intervenes in this young person. And whether it's helpful depends on whether it has the intended therapeutic effect and not just on extracting some number. So for example, it can point the young person for the purpose of screening just in the right direction for that level of care. Or unintendedly, it could also have contributions to, say, reification or stigma, for instance. So for instance, the young person might internalize the results of measurement in ways that conflict with or miss some of their own cultural language of distress in favor of the DSM's own language of distress, and reinforces with a number. And that is in itself an authoritative epistemic and social entity. So specific ethical concerns arise in this context. So I've already talked a bit, and Aran touched on some of these, but there are many ethical issues that arise in the context of measurement and mental health. So to name a few, as I was saying, one key word is stigma and reification. Measurement is a kind of labeling that can deeply affect how a person feels about themselves and how others treat them. And as I mentioned, numbers can reinforce this experience. Another big concern is data access and ownership for example, different Indigenous communities. In Canada's colonial context, Indigenous communities are rightly mistrustful of outside agencies collecting and using their data, and navigating those issues through the right frameworks is really important. So, for example, Canada's First Nation groups have come up with their own information governance framework called OCAP, which stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. And then, of course, another huge umbrella concern is inclusivity. Different dimensions of inclusion are important along age, gender, sexual orientation, ethnic background, whether you're a racialized person or not. And these are all especially important elements which are significant in considering work with youth, of course. We can wonder whether our measurement instruments and measurement practices are inclusive, or whether they're reinforcing oppression or exclusion or of different group identities or personal identities. So when thinking about some of these issues, the main question that started to animate all of our discussions during the project was just, how should we integrate measurement into practice in a way that's clinically meaningful and not harmful, or just merely an administrative matter? And when we were reflecting on this question, we identified 3 main gaps that we needed to grapple with in order to kind of start to help address that. And the first one is really that there is a disconnect between psychometric literature and clinical practice in mental health. So just to name a few, in psychometrics, there's an emphasis on statistical traits like validity, reliability, rather than on, say, clinical utility. There are multiple measures that are not developed for service delivery contexts, but for use in, say, national surveys like the K10. The K10 is a widely used measure of distress, like it's everywhere, but it actually was developed for census, and not by youth or with youth or in any way like that. And often without input from relevant population, exactly. Then the other two gaps are, first, there just seems to be a tension between the aims and values of patient-centered care and the hopes of collecting standardized data. They just seem at odds. And so in our conversations, clinicians at many levels often view measurement with some suspicion, and often as just a mere administrative burden, just something that somebody from the administration just asked them to fill out, and they just have to get through it to get on to what they really want to do, which is have a genuine conversation or connect with the young person that's at their door. And then another big area of concern is that the language of the items themselves in the questionnaires can be problem focused. Like, how sad have you been for the last 3 weeks? How upset have you? Who haven't you seen? How little have you slept? But your values in the organization are actually, you want to be strength focused and solutions based. So the sort of rigid questionnaires are just there to be used, but they're actually possibly already at odds with whatever it is that are the ends of your therapeutic values. And then finally, is that there is no systematic guide on the ethics of mental health measurement in a clinical context. So at the heart of these problems, and I think we realize that is that the behavioral and social sciences have long worked under the assumption that measurement is primarily an epistemic activity, a knowledge generating activity. But throughout this project, we've ended up thinking of measurement as primarily a kind of social intervention, an intervention on humans by humans. And so this kind of intervention produces knowledge, but also it transmits beliefs, it enforces values, and it reaffirms or destabilizes political and institutional order. It's hacking, order, are on tall. I think it's just worth kind of belaboring some reasons why values are at the heart of measurement in psychosocial measurement. So here are four important reasons why the role of ethical and social values in psychosocial measurement is intrinsically legitimate. First, the nature of constructs in the social and behavioral sciences is often such that ethical and social values are constitutive of the very content and necessary for choosing among the different possible operationalizations. So literally what we care about is constitutive of what we measure. So Cartwright and Runhart developed the idea of Balin concepts. And these are just concepts that are characterized by family resemblances within a cluster of related concepts rather than, for example, necessary and sufficient conditions. And so choosing among the multiple possible meanings of the cluster is only, it's only something you can do through a value-laden choice. You mentioned Anna Alexandrova's paper earlier, and it's exactly like how she also thinks very similarly about thick concepts, and exactly how you can only think about these kinds of concepts by making value-laden choices. So you have to think about ways in which you make those choices explicit, essentially. So this is true for things like civil war in the paper by Cartwright and Runhart, but it's actually also true for things like depression and distress or mental health. Like, what is that? Number two, measurement in these sciences is often normative. It's just explicitly normative. So like I had a political science professor in first year who was like, well, we really love to study war and peace, not the novel, but just War and Peace, because they're interested in human phenomena, but also because we want less of the first and just more of the second. And so it's just, all of these sciences have human amelioration as a goal. That's why we're using measurement. Number 3, and this kind of develops on the idea of looping effects. Humans are often affected positively or negatively by the very act of being measured. So this is just the general idea that these kinds are not just natural fixed kinds, they're interactive kinds. And the shape that are shaped and shape the humans that are interacting with them. And when, especially when just we describe them, the mere act of describing them or using them. And then finally, values play an important role in just interpreting evidence in these sciences. So giving the multiplicity of ways to interpret evidence and the lack of rich and precise theory a lot of the time. Values play a huge role in interpreting. Theoretical models of the measurement process tend to be significantly less detailed in the social and behavioral sciences than when you think about natural sciences, like what links a number in a thermometer to what our theory of temperature is, for instance. I think it's really important to point out, and it's come up several times, work in education and psychometrics has long acknowledged the role of values as intrinsic to measurement. But a lot of these insights have actually remained largely theoretical or have been deemed as too difficult to implement in practice or are just not implemented in practice as much as they ought to be. So that's Kane, Messick. So the very basic question just remains of like, what are we measuring and how should we measure it and why should we measure it at all? And so this question of whether you're measuring what you mean to measure is the question of validity, supposedly. And you might think that psychometrics is actually, and psychometric validation practice can actually be very sensitive to the new context or a new group of people. So for example, once a measure is created, like say the PHQ-9, its validity is not actually assumed to hold across all people and places. So it's like standard practice to revalidate a measure like the PHQ-9 for any new context. And it can just appear like validation can become very specific. So in ascending order of specificity, you can have validation study that targets a psychiatric sample. You can have a validation study of the PHQ-9 for patients with migraines. You can have the PHQ-9 validated for people with depression in a diabetes patient outpatient clinic. And a central goal of all of these validation studies is to determine the sort of just the right cutoff scores for different populations, ostensibly to secure whether it's been helpful to those new populations. So here is the PHQ-9 for Argentina, different cutoff scores that will be meaningful for the new population in Argentina. And they're just recalibrations that are done against an external criterion, like for instance, in this case, the mini international neuropsychiatric interview and the Beck depression inventory. And I think while this is no doubt helpful, you can still wonder if this is good enough warrant to help you decide whether this measurement will be adequate for you at your clinic. I think in fact, revalidation is often practiced, just leaves open all the questions that we started at the beginning with all the gaps that we identified when we were working with the folks at Foundry. But I think more than that, it increases the potential for harm of measurement. Because once something is valid, and this is something we were talking about, it appears to endorse the adequacy of the instrument, and people may feel safe to use it like they would use actually a thermometer. So it kind of ossifies the instrument into a set of meanings that are applied just top down to each new young person. But this rigidity is the opposite of what we want. With it, the genuine collaboration and co-interpretation with young people just becomes impossible. Oops. There we go. So how do we make sure that the use of the PHQ-9 is helpful and appropriate, even if it has been validated? And so a potential answer is just really by taking on Liam McClimon's views and developing genuine conversations surrounding measurement that promote client autonomy and collaborative decision-making. So that is by ensuring that the right values and ethical concerns are addressed. And this can vary depending on the purpose of measurement and the different interested parties at play. So recall the different kinds of purposes that are even named. Different interested parties can also vary broadly. So you can have progress tracking or screening, and they can interact with what matters to clinicians at a given point in time, what matters to this group of young people at this point in time, or that group of young people at this point in time, a broader community, parents, teachers, the funder, government. All of these are permutations of possible things that matter to different groups that need to be adjudicated in a sense. So I suppose it bears repeating that the role of values is really important, as many of us have said today. And so these are some of the values that came up as important in our interactions at Foundry. But I kind of separate them here into different categories of values, like ethical, social, pragmatic, epistemic. I think this is important because you can notice that some of these values can actually pull in different directions, right? Like I can care about a young person's well-being, I can care about autonomy of the young person, but I might also really care about efficiency of my service and the scalability of my service. And those are, there's nothing immoral about caring about efficiency or scalability. Actually, you can care about these things for very moral reasons. That's why you care about them. You want to serve and help more people. So there's principled reasons why you care about any one of these values. And there's therefore trade-offs for how you're going to deal with these values. So again, you need a method for adjudicating how you're going to deal with all of these different possible conflicts that arise. So just to repeat, as we said, there are at least 4 main reasons to think that these values are constitutive of social measurement, the kinds that we talked about. That's because they're intrinsically part of the construct, because measurement is normative, because they target interactive kinds that affect people, and because evidence is underdetermined. Then we need to ensure that the construct and its method of measurement are coordinated in right of the right values. So we're just, and it's important to note and to stress, we're not suggesting that we should introduce values to measurement. We're really saying measurements, values are already part of measurement. They're embedded from the get-go. So you can either sort of embrace that and take it on board, or kind of close your eyes and just hope that they were the right ones to begin with. But really what you should be wondering is, how do we ensure that measurement practice is aligned with the values that we do care about, the values that we do want to select? Or, so it's not, again, also to stress that our proposal is not just to manage the values, for example, as near sources of bias. So I've talked about educational psychometrics, and that's really inspiring in terms of acknowledging value. That, for example, the standards of education and psychological testing does have a really important chapter on fairness, but it actually does relegate and seem to relegate fairness to like how to standardize as well as possible, and to think about variance and diversity as possible sources of bias. But I think, as Femke illustrates so beautifully with all of her research, like this is the richness of the people's stories that we're talking about. We're not testing people to see if they can make it to a different institution. We're finding out what's up with them so that we can help them. So if we like really lose out the richness of it, then we're really kind of not doing a good job. So I think the point is not to just manage them away, but to introduce a procedure into measurement practice that will make values explicit, so that interested parties can deliberate explicitly about what matters to them in the relevant measurement practice. So here's where the rich conceptual resources of philosophy of measurement can come in handy. In the philosophy of measurement, there's just a well-established idea of something called epistemic iterations. And so An epistemic iteration is sort of the coordination of a quantity concept with its method of measurement, its instrument, in a gradual and iterative process. So in other words, the process of inquiry that led us to trust the meaning that the number in our thermometer corresponds to what we understand theoretically at temperature was a gradual, iterative, messy process. With each iteration, with each iteration, some prior traditions are and beliefs concerning what we're interested in studying or measuring are retained, while others are revised in order to resolve inconsistencies and reduce measurement error. So in this way, our theory of our property, our understanding and theory of the thing that we're interested in measuring, in the case of the examples historically that are used are like clocks, like Professor Tall's work is on universal time, but also temperature by Asif Chang, for example. And they really kind of show historically how there's this interplay between theory and instrument, and how together it is this process that kind of gets you to refine it, because there's to be refined. I can talk more about that if people are interested after. And so here is a quote from Asif Chang, just to kind of give you a flavor of the idea. So there are two modes of progress enabled by iteration. The first one's enrichment, in which the initially affirmed system is non-negated but refined, resulting in the enhancement of some of its epistemic virtues. And then there's self-correction, in which the initially affirmed system is actually altered and its content or result of inquiry, in its content as a result of inquiry based on its own. So both enrichment and self-correction often occur simultaneously in one iterative process. So in a paper under review, myself, Iran, and Sky argue that in the behavioral and social sciences, another kind of iteration is also important. We argue that we should think about ethical iterations as a constitutive part of the process of measurement in the social and behavioral sciences, alongside epistemic iterations. So ethical iterations are an iterative deliberative process around values. And so here would just be the broad structure of the proposal for what they should involve. In the first place, parties should, I think, you can, because it's supposed to be an iterative process, like you should really be able to jump in at any one of these points, but I'll just take it from the top square, where parties should reflect on the values that guide theories about a construct and design, selection, and or interpretation of the measure of that construct. And so I think, like, in the perfect world, we would all be able to design a bespoke measure for any one of our particular needs. And indeed, some scholars have tried and are trying to do this, like Anna Alexandrova in that paper you cited, Democratizing Measurement. That's a really good paper on like how different expert groups contribute to the design of a new quality of life measure. But a lot of the time, that's not actually the case. A lot of the time, we're just stuck with measures that are already given to us, like the PHQ-9. So then we have to reflect on what is the conception of depression that's there, and et cetera. Number two, they should gather evidence about the consequences of theorizing about the construct and of designing, using, or interpreting the measure, given the values that we've identified. They should collect evidence about the values and concerns of interested parties that are affected by using a measure. 4, they should revise values, their relative importance, and their trade-offs in light of evidence, as well as the general normative considerations. And 5, modify conceptions of the construct and the design, selection, and or interpretation of the measure, thinking about those previous stages. I think key to this is the broad involvement of relevant interested parties at all stages of this process, from young people to their families, to community members, service providers, government offenders. So in the case of the PHQ-9, it would involve reflecting on the values that guide the design of the PHQ-9 and its conception of depression i.e. the DSM concept of major depressive disorder. Does that work for this right now? Is that suitable for our purposes? Like, do we want to use it as a diagnostic tool? Is there value to using it as a diagnostic tool right now? Or do we really want to be using it as a screener if it's like seems to be coming off with extra or loaded information? Collecting evidence about the effects of using the PHQ-9 for screening, for instance, which was just the pet example I've been using in light of the values that we've been talking about. And so this is key in terms of measurement in relation to the values we've identified, and asking ourselves, what do we want to come out of this instance of measurement for the benefit of the client at this time point in their health journey? 3, engaging young people and their communities, as well as service providers and foundry management, about what matters to them as clients, as service providers. What are clients expecting, as I said, at that time point? And how would introducing measurement hinder or help those expectations? 4, almost done. Comparing, revising, or developing a set of values based on foundries values, for example, in this case, or those of young people or their peers, as well as on general ethical principles or frameworks that you might want to take on. And then, in light of these values, again, deciding whether a construct like depression is the right target for the purpose of measurement that you're using it at that time, whether the PHQ-9 is the right tool for that construct, whether the purpose of measurement is aligning with Foundry's values at that time, or, and I think this is what's kind of important to stress, is that we're really focusing on it as a measurement practice. Creating processes that couch the instrument if you're not happy with the instrument that's possible for you at the time, right? Like, so make sure that if this is the only instrument that you can use for screening, I don't know why, but suppose, then you really make sure that you have a debriefing process afterwards. So it's like, well, this was just like a step care model, like something to point you in a certain direction. It's really not supposed to be having any diagnostic value for you at this time or something like that. I think that that's what's important to consider in terms of, it basically just turns into value check-ins as often as possible in like a sort of structured way at different points in time to reassess. So I suppose in thinking about identifying our values for our practice, it's important to identify them at the beginning, as you were talking about today, Joe, but also thinking about like, how can we refine these values over time, and how can we check back in to see that these are working as well, and whether that is reflective against still the kind of measurement practice that we're trying to implement, or that we are implementing. Okay, so we think ethical iterations help address 3 of the gaps. Go some way in addressing 3 of the gaps that I identified early on. So this were, again, just to remind you, a disconnect between psychometric literature and clinical practice, tension between data collection and patient-centered care, and there's no normative theory. So in other words, without a process to deal with values in an explicit way that integrates it, we get a rigid top-down measurement practice that misses what matters to interested parties. With ethical iterations, should come up with a different name. What matters in clinical practice is at the front and center of meaningful interpretation of the measurement instrument and their context, right? Like it puts it front and center what actually matters for the decision in clinical practice at the time, by virtue of the values of the people that are identifying those values. What matters to young people guides the measurement practice and different interested parties, but I think this is one way in which it's clear how to inject important parties, in this case young people, at many different time points and over time iteratively, to make sure that the measurement practice is ongoing, is learning in the right way. And then, you know, we're not offering a full-fledged theory, normative theory of measurement, but at least it offers a structured way in which values and conflicts between them can be deliberated about and adjudicated between them. So more than anything, we're left with a kind of clear, somewhat flexible method for asking, should we measure? I think it's really important that we can think that the answer might be no, we should not measure, but maybe yes. And then if so, what should we measure? How should we characterize it? How should we implement that practice? And I think most importantly, why are we even engaging in this measurement practice? Not in a, I mean, both at a very abstract high level, but also just for at this time point in this health journey for this young person within this organization in this location. I think that takes me to my conclusion. So I think just to sum up, ethical iterations are the feedback loops required to coordinate the concept of the measured attribute with the methods and aims of its measurement so as to obtain an ethically justified fit between them. And then in work in progress, kind of thinking more about questions of validity, thinking about other notions that might be sort of resourceful or helpful to get out of the box of thinking that this is valid or it's not valid. And so thinking about things like fitness for purpose, what could it mean to think about fitness for purpose? Well, it seems like we proposed at the very end of the paper that it might be something like the virtuous alignment of our answers to what, why, and how. But where this is just a normative requirement that entails both kinds of iterations. It entails both the epistemic knowledge, I guess, knowledge first approach and the values first approach working in tandem to cohere into the appropriate coordination of the instrument in the practice that we want it to be used in for me. That's it.
We started 5 minutes late, so we'll just go 5 minutes. That's okay with you? Questions for Sebastian? Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Sebastian. I really liked your talk, and I absolutely love the idea of the iterations, which is this whole dynamic concept that also allows for self-correction, which is fantastic, I think. I was a bit puzzled by during your talk about the right values that came up like several times, because the right values is of course quite a value-laden thing to think about. And I was just like thinking that very often we only realize our values when it went wrong, right? So we know that we were not very inclusive, and now all of a sudden like the emphasis is very much on like the right values of inclusive language, etc., which is fantastic, right? But sometimes we need sort of this moment of going wrong in values to realize what the good values are or the right values are. But then we have a bit of a problem, because very often by the time we realize we might have been wrong, a whole lot has already been institutionalized, which sort of jeopardizes the room to self-correct at all. So how does that fit in this sort of circle? Like the institutionalization versus the correction?
Right, yeah, I mean, I think that just from a more conceptual point of view, I think that I was kind of wondering, should I even say the right values? But I think the point is, it's supposed to signal that it's about the values that you want to endorse at that point in the iterative process. And the reason that, you know, iteration is supposed to facilitate enrichment, but also self-correction, is because it's supposed to take mistakes along. And it's not like you can be mistaken about your values, or you can be if you want, but you could just change your mind, or you can figure out that that's not really working for you the way that you wanted it to. But then, you know, so then that is why it's important to consider it an iterative process. I really liked the idea of epistemic humility for that reason, the way that you characterize it, because it's tentative, you know, think about these kinds of iterations as tentative in some way, and as thinking about it doing some repeat over time. So, I mean, I don't know what that means for the nitty-gritty of like actual institutionalization. I think as a lot of the talks, I mean, I think as Aran suggested earlier, if people take on board really thinking differently about the sort of organic bottom-up way of meaning making that might be involved in measurement, then it really does mean rethinking how things get entrenched in institutions, and like how flexible, or whether it's possible to be flexible about what gets taken up, you know. So I think this is like an idealized model of like what would conceptually be working, hopefully. But I think, yeah, in terms of like the nitty-gritty of how it would work politically, I'm not sure.
Anne-Marie and then Sky.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. I really enjoyed it, and as you might guess, I'm pretty on board with the majority of what you said. But I think it might be just a minor point. But when you presented this idealized model of epistemic ethical iteration, like I think the first step was reflecting on the values, and then I missed some steps, but then engaging young people and then deliberating. But I was wondering if you would allow some space for engagement earlier in the loop, in the sense that, you know, just reflecting on the values might be something, might be a right moment for inclusion. So maybe this is something you already had in mind, but was not in the loop. So
no, thanks for that clarification. I think it's important to like really stress that for any one of those points, like the different interested parties are really supposed to be part of that deliberation at every point. So in this case, young people would be part of, like, you know, in the ideal world, the design of the measure would be actually through co-creation and collaboration for a new measure. If you can't, then you may have a roster of different measures for depression that you might want to use. Well, then who should you ask? Which ones resonate best? Well, the young people in the room. And so likewise, how do they respond to different measures, like how even items, things like that. So I think it's important to note for sure that I suppose that should have just read as re-engaging with youth at that point about values, but at every single one of those instances, they are involved in the conversation.
Sure. Sky's next.
And thank you, as always. I'm not going to sleep tonight thinking about what you said. I just think like the whole day has just made me think about, we've talked a lot about this like ideal system, or a lot on the patient burden, like, you know, in terms of let's involve them, let's co-design better measures. And then I might talk about like crying on Friday mornings, because sometimes I'd be so frustrated, like this is perfect, but we can't do it, like, because this happened to the community this day, or that happened, or we bought a data system that's not flexible, or like, you know, these realistic systems. So I just wondering your reflections on you know, we could start a new planet and like start and build our mental health system, but we're kind of almost in that, building a new mental health system in this phase. But like, are we too far? Sometimes I wonder about how to do this, or there's just this balance of how do we make the ideal the norm or the standard, and how do we get past all the stuff in the way right now? And you don't have to answer that, but I've been thinking so much about the burden on the patient, the burden on us as researchers and also as leaders, but like, why is this not, it's so obviously right, you know, and the right thing to do, but we're not doing it. We
No,
can't.
thank you for that question. So I think one thing to think about is that a lot of the stuff that we've proposed today or thought about today would be really demanding to implement. But I think in terms of thinking about ethical iterations, so thinking about epistemic iterations, that's just a descriptive project in a way. This is just how actually instruments get made and how theories get refined. So the point about ethical iterations is both descriptive and prescriptive. Like, you can choose not to engage with values, but they're in there already. Like, whoever made the PHQ-9, whoever made your new quality of life measure, that they have injected their values into your question. So you are dealing with tools that have values embedded in them already. So in that sense, ethical iterations or the process of refining that measure was an iterative process of values that you can think of was dubiously ethical. And the point of saying ethical iterations is because it takes up this sort of de facto value iteration, and it says you need to kind of grab a hold of it and make it ethical. So how would you do it? And I think, yeah, I think it does seem like it's not like, yeah, I think I would just say that. I think it just means that you need to take on board the fact that values are there, and you need to make it explicit which ones it is that you are acknowledging, or at least, are selecting, and then thinking, you know, if we really want to have a value-driven practice, like what does that really mean from the beginning to the end? Like, how do you take that on? And if not, then you're really kind of just ignoring that there are other values that are there, that are doing things that you may want, that might be good or bad, and you just may have no way of deciding that.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I know there are more questions. Maybe Dan, you can ask your question over dinner.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Of course.
So let's thank Sebastian again. Quick words of thanks before we conclude for today. First of all, thank you all for this wonderful workshop. I hope you all learned at least as much as I have. I definitely have a lot to process. And I'd like to thank a few individuals that made this workshop possible. First of all, to Professor Amélie Kesner-Vallet, the chair of this department where we're at, Deep, who welcomed this and embraced the idea of this workshop back in the summer with enthusiasm and allocated the resources, both space and administration, to make this happen. Huge thanks. I know she's not here right now, but you've seen her, Anaïk Fautier. She seems to be everywhere all at once, sending you emails at 6 a.m. She meticulously handled every detail of this workshop, from catering to travel to registration. So I can't imagine better support. So thank you.
She's listening.
Oh,
No, that was
great.
someone else.
No,
That was
that's
her.
someone else? Okay.
She was walking around.
I want to also thank Jennifer Proudfoot and Sodia Bickler for helping to publicize this event and for helping out with during the day. Special thanks to my students, Asi Chifchi and Sebastian, for your help throughout the day. Spoke and attended both in person and online. Thank you very much. Speaker will be going out to dinner after this, so please stick around. And also, finally, before you all just go, please join us for a group photo somewhere here, maybe in this room, or we'll find a spot. Other than that, thanks again for being here and making this event.
Thank you.
Thank you.